Hey, everyone. Welcome to the relationship between the states and national government. For everyone following along with the AP government curriculum, this is Unit 1.7. It's another rainy Monday. I found a classroom with no one in it. Odds of someone coming in and interrupting this are probably pretty high, but let's give this a shot. So before we start, keep in mind that the relationship between the states and the national government is complicated, right? It is a federal relationship, something that was created with our Constitution. It was a much different relationship under the Articles of Confederation. And because it did strengthen the national government and weaken the states' governments, that's why we had the anti-federalists, so many people who were actually against the Constitution for that reason. And the debates and the conflict between the states and the federal government existed in the beginning, and they continue to some degree to this day. And we often look at things in the news or on C-SPAN, and we'll be like, this is because of federalism, right? This is some sort of conflict, some sort of tension in that relationship. So we're just going to look at a little bit of it today and how it's shifted over time. So when you click on the power button, what powers does the federal government have, and what powers do states governments have? There are some powers that are explicitly outlined in the Constitution that are not as negotiable as, say, others are. So we have exclusive powers to the national government. We also have shared powers that both governments have, and we also have powers that belong just to the states. It's good, if you didn't already, to make sure you understand previous parts of the unit to then within those governments, what powers do they have? So example, in our federal legislative government, how they can make laws, collect taxes, how the executive branch does things like make treaties and is the head commander-in-chief, how things like the judicial branch can review the constitutionality and equity under laws in the Constitution. All right, so what powers exist explicitly to one or the other? What powers are left to the states? This is where the 10th Amendment comes in. So this is in our Bill of Rights. The 10th Amendment says, the powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. All right, so if it's not explicitly outlined in the Constitution that this belongs to the federal government or that the states can't have it, it's then a power that the state has or that the people have. How do you know which is which? Basically, it's case by case. But this is a very important amendment when it comes to things. Now, what is traditionally left to the states to decide? And this has changed a little bit, but things like education, right? Most schools get more money from state governments than the federal government because the states have more control and make more laws regarding it. Things to do with health. Now, we saw some blurring of this over COVID, state laws versus federal laws, right? Also things like marriage. Maybe it's the age of marriage. Who can get married? We'll look at the Supreme Court case Loving Virginia, where until just a few decades ago, Virginia outlawed biracial marriage. And that's when the Supreme Court came in and said, oh, that's taking away someone's natural rights, so you can't do that, right? So you see involvement there. Also some laws involving morality. That could be the age you drink alcohol, right? Now that's pretty universal. How did that happen? We'll get to that in a few minutes. Also things like gambling, right? That would be a morality law. And also we have police powers, different laws and different law enforcements that go state by state. That could be involving things just like boating rules and boating licensing, adoption rules, hunting and fishing licenses, right? You go to your state for that, not to the national government. All those sorts of things. Now, sometimes a power is shared by both the federal government and the state government, and that is known as a concurrent power. Now, as you may know, or you'll soon find out, both the national government and state governments and local governments can levy taxes, right? You pay taxes for both governments. Both maintain roads. Some are county, local roads, some are state roads, some are interstate highways. Courts, you have state courts, you have federal courts, and also borrowing money as well. Now, states also have obligations to other states. An example is the full faith and credit clause. This basically says a marriage license, a birth certificate, something like that, that is good in one state should then for be considered good in another state. You see this political cartoon here, sort of jabbing at that because when same-sex marriage became accepted by some states, it was therefore not accepted to other states. And then eventually we did get the federal government involved with that. Also, you have privileges and immunities that you can't discriminate. Like you can't tax one person more coming into your state because they're from one state than another state, right? You can't have like interstate discrimination. And then also extradition. That's like if someone commits a crime in your state, you can still return them to their state. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be punished or have a trial, right? But that you have to follow certain laws that deal with things like that. All right, now the line of when does the national government get involved? When are things completely to the states? That has shifted over time. And what has created those shifts? Well, we have political ideologies. For example, during the Reagan administration, believed in a policy of devolution. You may hear the term devolution revolution, where Reagan and his administration wanted to return as much power to the states and away from the federal government as possible. So that would be an example. You also have natural disasters. We just were faced with Hurricane Ian, right? So how does a natural disaster, when a federal government is obligated to respond, right? Not in the Constitution says you have to respond, but right, morality deems appropriate to respond. That has sometimes the federal government involved more. Finances, how money is spent then on those states change. So things like natural disasters can cause these shifts as well. And what happens often when there's things like natural disasters or just other issues? Well, there's money involved. And this is where we see grants. And there's several different types of grants. Okay, so how does this happen? Federal government can collect taxes. They do collect taxes. And what they can decide to do is to actually return some of that money to the states. This is called revenue sharing or cooperative federalism, where the federal government is cooperating with the states. So maybe states are going to use this money for safety, for education, for clean water, for disaster relief, right? This is, hey, this state is going to get some more money because of this, right? So not all states are obligated to get the same sort of money in return. That angers some states. We want some of this money, but the federal government has to decide where the need is. There's also things like categorical grants. And categorical, think of a specific category. So they'll have a specific agenda. The federal government will give the state money, but you must do X, Y, and Z with it. Okay. There's block grants. The block grants is sort of like no strings attached. Here's a bunch of money. Spend this on infrastructure, or spend this on some way to help education. Not really specifics, but just an area. And some of this can be used for help. Often this can also be used for control as well. Think of revenue sharing. Hey, you want this money? Well, what federal laws are you going to now sort of embrace for this money? And you see that a lot with mandates. So a mandate is that there's federal money, but a state has to follow a procedure, a protocol, some sort of law. Like, hey, if you want this money, you have to make sure you change your drinking age to 21 instead of 18, which was done in the past. If you want this money, you must do this, right? If you saw this a little bit throughout COVID as well. So if you comply, you'll be rewarded with funding. Now, there's also some mandates that are unfunded, and that means you have to comply, but even if you do, you're not going to get money. So what's the motivation to comply? There not always is some. There isn't always a motivation. It can be in other ways. So I'm just looking for a recent example of grants. This article is from just a few, I think October 21st, so just a few days ago. And this was the New York Times. And there was an article about how women who were pregnant and addicted to drugs were so much more likely to die than women who weren't. So what could be done about that? And the whole article explained the causes of what could be done. And something the federal government is now doing is offering grants. So the plan also includes tens of millions of dollars in various grants to organizations, hospitals, and rural communities. So, there's a lot of people addicted to drugs here. There's a lot of people dying here. We're going to give you this money. Now, it didn't say if it was a categorical grant, but I think it would be. I don't think it'd be a block grant. And so here's this money, but this is what you need to do to try to reduce these awful numbers. All right, so that's an example. So when you see these concurrent powers, when you see the federal government and the state governments involved in these different types of shared powers, that is known as marble cake federalism. You also will hear that as maybe cooperative federalism. All right, so think of a cake where it's chocolate and vanilla. You can't really slice someone just one piece or the other. It's all mixed together. Now, in the past, our country operated more under layer cake federalism, which is also known as dual federalism, where each part, the federal or the state government, had specific areas that they had powers to do, and it didn't really blend in with the others. It says the past. There's areas where there's still sort of layer cake federalism, but as a whole, we're much more of a marble cake federalism to this day. Why did this change? Even though we're not a history course, it's important to understand that history and historical events shaped the change from a layer cake to this marble cake. So a lot of this change started happening in the late 1800s. Now think about what was going on in our country in the late 1800s. We have the Industrial Revolution. So things are becoming less agrarian and more industrial. We have different types of work. We have more urbanization. We have different forms of transportation, different forms of energy. And with that forms of transportation, like the railroad, it is connecting more parts of our country, and more parts of our country are now interacting, and more parts of our country are now dependent on one another. So states became the center of this area, of many areas of business and government that used to just belong to the federal government. And the federal government saw this and they said, we want to try to regulate some of this commerce, right? As trade was now happening more and more between the states. So we have to think, how did history create this political shift? In the past, they each had their designated areas. And now just think of things just blending more. And with our society blending more, with technology blending and transportation blending more, that meant the government sort of had to blend more as well. And we also see this in our amendments. So Amendment 16, and look at this is 1913, so in the Industrial Revolution's in full effect now. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. So this sort of increased the ability to tax. And because of this interstate commerce, interstate transportation, they saw more of a need and also more of a benefit of taxing. And also we have here local problems becoming state problems. If there was a local business at a transportation hub, say like a city center, and maybe that messed up when trains were arriving somewhere else and goods were being received. Maybe it affected the workers. Maybe it affected what they were receiving. It could even affect all sorts of things, right? The times things were happening. So whenever there was an issue, because of that local problem now became a much bigger problem and possibly a national problem, where in the past it would just sort of stay in that little bubble. So that needed then, once again, more of an influence from the federal government, because something that might be happening in Pennsylvania can now be affecting something happening in New York or Georgia or anywhere else in the nation. So just keep in mind, right, there is a shift, and there's been a continued shift in increasing federal powers and sometimes increasing state powers. It's not always gone in one direction, right? Even though it seems to be that federal powers are growing and states are decreasing, there has been times, like the devolution revolution, where it goes back to states. And when we look at court cases being seen now by the Supreme Court and different laws being passed, we'll talk about this. Is this something that really belongs to be reserved to the state, or is this something where the federal government should be involved? So some of these things that have caused the shift, here's just examples over time. We have the 14th Amendment, which was one of our Reconstruction amendments created after the Civil War, really to help with issues coming with civil rights from the Civil War. We listened to that recent Supreme Court case where Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson explains the origin of the 14th Amendment. So this passed in 1868 meant civil rights, that the federal government had more of an obligation to protect civil rights if states were not protecting certain civil rights of the people. We also see different shifts over national events like the Great Depression, aid to the poor. Maybe the federal government had to step in and provide aid that the state governments just weren't doing. All right, so that's just some examples to see that over time there's shifts. Okay, so next we're going to talk a little bit more about the Constitution and federalism. So federalism is complicated. That doesn't mean you can't understand it, but just know it's something that shifts, and that's what makes it even more complicated. But you got this. Talk soon.